Revenge of the Black Cloak Society, a King's Quest-based fic. Chapter 1. Wickedly Sweet. Queen Valenice of Daventry entered the throne room. She wore her special blue dress, the one which she wore when she first entered the land of Eldritch. Of course, her first visit there was very trying, since it was the time Rosella had apparently been abducted by a malevolent force. It had played out differently, as Rosella and herself ended up saving Eldritch, and Rosella was now engaged to the prince of the land, Edgar. Even reflecting on that adventure, she remembered how Edgar was the same one that helped Rosella back into Mir. Of course, she only could guess what the boy looked like before, since only Rosella had seen him. Knowing how well Edgar and her daughter got along, she wasn't surprised that her daughter was finally getting married. Well, not married, she corrected herself, but engaged. At least Rosella was in Eldritch right now, helping in the planning of the wedding. She knew Rosella would be upset that Derek had gotten ill. Derek was well loved by all the royal family. The man that replaced him, until he recovered, Cale Silver, was working to do Derek's job. Of course, Cale was trying to understand all of the information that Derek had managed to gather. She also noticed that Cale had a copy of one of the Daventry maps that Derek had crudely drawn. As she approached the throne, she heard the new historian ask, "Your Majesty, I still fail to see why the map of Daventry, at the time you quested to become king, is so small. Also, what happened to the house where you defeated the witch, Dahlia?" She could see some unease in her husband's face as he said, "Those were very trying times for Daventry, Cale. My predecessor was nearing the end of his life, and he had asked me to reclaim the three lost treasures of Daventry. Dahlia had stole them years ago, and even placed a spell on King Edward. As the end of his life drew near, the spell would shrink the kingdom, causing it to disappear and destroying all those trapped inside. During that time, if you tried to leave the kingdom, you were transported to the other side." She noticed a look of amazement had crossed Cale's face. "Once the treasures were reclaimed?" The spell had changed. Now the spell encircled Dahlia's home, preventing anyone from reaching the place. That is probably for the best, since we don't need anyone entering the place and becoming victim to any lingering dark magic. She had to nod in agreement when he said that. It was also at that time that her husband realized that she had entered the room. "Valenice, when did you arrive?" She smiled at her husband and said, "Just a moment ago. I overheard you talking about Dahlia, and you are right about not wanting anyone to find her place. You were even lucky when you entered Hagatha's lair when you rescued me those years ago. In fact, I'm beginning to think that she knew Dahlia. She had cast a similar spell on Kalima, and that spell disappeared when you rescued me." Valenice saw a look of deep thought on her husband's face. She had remembered hearing from her husband a few days ago that Dahlia had been a member of the Black Cloak Society. She then saw a smile cross his face as he said, "Well, we should be able to get some information. I see Connor is contacting us." She then glanced over at the magic mirror and saw the image of the young man who had saved the country from the evil of Lucrito. King Graham was glad to see the face of the young hero that saved Daventry. He got up from his throne and walked over to the mirror. "Hail, Champion Eternal!" He smiled as the young champion said, Hail, Graham, King of Daventry. It has been a while since we last talked, sire. I wish all I have to tell you was good news. When he heard that, Graham felt a feeling of dread start in him. Ever since the events which had turned many of them to stone, Graham had come to listen to any news that came from the realm of the sky, especially if it was from the Mask of Eternity. He looked at the young man and said, "What has the Mask of Eternity said, Connor?" He waited as a worried look crossed the young face. "I fear the Mask has predicted a serious threat. It has said there will be many dark days ahead of you. The Mask said only that, but I fear it is linked to the society you mentioned. The Archons up here have been finding out a lot of information about them." Graham closed his eyes and calmed himself down. He then looked at Connor and said, "What have they found out? Anything about the members of the society?" He saw Connor nod. "What did they find out?" He watched as Connor let out a heavy sigh. "They have found out that the one who caused the problems up here was a member. He may have been given the task to turn only the humans to stone. He had hid his background well, since the members of the Black Cloak know many spells for disguising and changing their appearance. That didn't set well with him. He didn't like the fact that the members of the Black Cloak could hide their identities. If they could do that, they might be able to infiltrate Daventry." He then heard his wife say, "Who else was members of the Black Cloak Society, Sir Connor?" He watched as Connor straightened up and said, "Queen Valenice, I didn't realize you were there as well. The Archons have found out that Hagatha is a long-time member. However, she is in hiding right now. Also, the evil fairy Lalotte was a member until your daughter destroyed her. It also appears that Militia was also a member." Graham then started to pace. With most of those members dead or incapacitated, the only ones we would have to worry about would be Hagatha and Shadrach. Am I correct, Sir Connor? He didn't like it when Connor said, "I do not think so, sire." He then looked back at Connor as the young man said, "Hagatha is in hiding, but some of the spells she knows prevents the Archons from finding her. Also, it appears that the spirits of the dead members seem to be waiting in the world. I took time to contact all of the beings in charge of the lands of death, and none have reported the spirits of Dahlia or Lalotte. It could be that they are waiting for a dark spell to revive them." He stopped pacing and thought about Connor's statement. If the spirits were waiting for such a thing, it would take a powerful wizard to cast it. He looked at the Champion Eternal. "I wonder if that is something that Shadrach would be able to do, reviving and restoring his fallen society members." He watched as Connor thought about it. "He might be able to. The Archons have informed me that such a spell can only take place at the home of the individual. However, someone that powerful would leave some sort of magical trail while moving." As Connor spoke, Graham became alarmed. The magic mirror was covering with an evil cloud. It was a sign that dark days were already upon them. He then remembered what had happened the last time the mirror clouded up. It had been the day that Alexander had been abducted. He heard Valenice gasp and realized that she also knew the meaning of the clouding over. It also meant she remembered the last time it had happened. Cale Silver looked on at the scene in front of him. He could see that both Graham and Valenice were worried about what had happened, but it was fortunate. If the mirror hadn't fogged up, it was possible that they might start to realize who he really was. For now, he had to keep up his guise. He waited to speak until he was sure the panic levels had reached the right point. "Sire, what has happened, and why are you so worried?" He watched as both King Graham and Queen Valenice looked at him in shock, but hers was more noticeable. He then watched as King Graham regained his wits and responded to his question. "I fear, Cale, that this is a sign of bad things for the kingdom of Daventry. Many years ago, the mirror fogged up like this. It was at the time that our son Alexander was abducted. We were able to survive that hardship, but until he made his way back to us, the mirror was useless." He nodded, keeping his own thoughts inside. That spell had been one of Manannan's best spells. Of course, Manannan also liked plans that took time to come to completion. Manannan had even made it appear like he needed the king's son as a servant. Of course, he knew Manannan used magic to maintain his home. It was all part of a plan to ruin the kingdom of Daventry. He then looked over at the king and said, "Sire, maybe we should continue the recording of history later. Do you mind if I return to my quarters?" He watched as the king nodded and said, "That will be fine, Cale. I need to get Crispin. Maybe he can find a way to unfog the mirror. Valenice, try to send a letter to Alexander and to Rosella. I want to be sure they are safe." As he left the room, he heard Valenice say, "I'll use the mirror that Archduke Fifi gave me. I still don't think he's aware that I had borrowed it when I was searching for Rosella." As he continued to his room, he thought about what Valenice had said. She had most likely stolen it during the search she had mentioned. It had to be when Militia had been defeated. He remembered that the age regression device had been found. It was powerful magic, and it could even damage him. It wouldn't turn him into a baby like it had in Militia, but it would put a serious dent in his powers. He was still working on a spell to reverse the effects of the device. He was going to need it in the future for his plan to truly succeed. When he finally reached his room, he quickly cast an invisibility spell on himself. He knew that the mirror fogging was a signal. He had made sure that Manannan could still cast the spell, as well as a few others, even though his fellow Black Cloak member was a cat. What the signal meant was that the bandit they had encountered on their way to Daventry had found Dahlia's home. He now had to get the ingredients for the spell together. He knew where each ingredient was, but he also knew that the bandit would bring the last ingredient to them. As he gathered the ingredients together, he wondered if after he resurrected Dahlia, what she would do to the bandit. His resurrection spell only required one body. He smiled when he thought that Dahlia would turn the bandit into one of her life-sized cookies. Dahlia had always had a sweet tooth. Once he had all the stuff together, he looked out the room's window and then cast a teleportation spell that would take him to the forest where Dahlia's house would be. Brutus couldn't believe it. After all the time searching the woods, he had found the house of Dahlia. He couldn't remember why he had to find it, but he had found it. As he neared the house, he could tell that a sweet smell filled the air. He saw the reason for that when he got a better look at the house. The entire building was made out of sweets. He was surprised at how good it smelled. It was like the building was made yesterday, but he knew in his mind that the building had stood for over 20 years unoccupied. He also noticed the strange statues that were in the yard. They all looked like gingerbread likenesses of people. As he glanced over them, he got a feeling of dread from the scared and frightened looks on their faces. They might have actually been real people before Dahlia turned them into this. He worked past that dread feeling and entered the front door. As he looked around, he was stunned that the place was spotless. It looked like someone was still living here, but he knew that wasn't the case. He walked over to the far wall and shuddered at the appearance of a cell in the room. It wasn't something he wanted to see, since he was a bandit. He had always feared being put in one of those for an extended time. He then noticed a lone bedroom. He walked into it and looked around. He was surprised to see a portrait of King Edward, the king before King Graham. He wondered who the woman was next to him, and then realized what it meant. Dahlia had posed to be a woman that Edward loved. He was only a child when Graham became king. Prior to that, the kingdom had entered into very dark times. He then started to wonder why he even searched for this place to begin with. When he stepped out of the bedroom, he froze. Sitting on the table in the main room was the same cat he had seen with the cloaked man he encountered earlier. As he looked at the cat, he wondered how it had followed him. He didn't notice the creature before. Was it magical like this location? He soon got an answer as the cat said, "Congratulations on finding Dahlia's home. Shadrach will be pleased with you. He will be on his way now, and you have another task to perform. You need to bring a chaste maiden here. When you do that, you will be rewarded." Brutus wanted to say to the feline that he didn't like kidnapping, but something in him said it would be all right. He just nodded and said, "I'll do it." He then headed out of the house and towards the town. As he walked, he wondered why he was doing these things. He had never before wanted to find the witch's house. He didn't even want to kidnap a maiden. People usually frowned on that action. To be honest with himself, he never before wanted to do anything like this. And who was Shadrach? Was that the man who he encountered before he felt these urges to find these things? He couldn't even remember not wanting to do these things. He then felt that the sooner he finished these tasks, then things would be right again. He then walked faster to get to town. Anne was standing outside the pub, talking with some of the other ladies in the town of Daventry. Many had gone to the fountain outside the pub to get some water for use later in the day. She had gone there to talk with her friend Sarah. Ever since Sarah's boyfriend Connor became the champion eternal, her friend was a celebrity. However, that wasn't the big gossip today. Everyone seemed to be talking about a wedding. She hadn't known who was getting married, but she was curious. "Excuse me, but who's getting married? I didn't hear who you said was getting married." She felt embarrassed when all the ladies looked at her in shock. "You didn't know? Princess Roselle is going to be getting married. She's in the kingdom of Eldritch now." She was shocked at this news. She looked over at her friend, who was now a welcome person at the castle, and said, "Sarah, is this true? Rosella is getting married? She watched as her friend nodded. I said long ago that she was courting Edgar from Eldritch. Marriage was only bound to happen. I'm also sure it will be a lovely wedding. She then saw a happy look cross Sarah's face. I hope that at some point Connor and I can get married. She heard all the ladies giggle at that, but she decided to be quiet. Most of the other ladies in town had a man in their life. She was the only one in the group without a man. She left the fountain area and started to head up the road to the home her parents lived in. As she walked, she started to wish that fate would send her a handsome man to take her away from being alone in the world. She needed to get away from her life. She needed someone to spend it with. It was at that time that she noticed a figure appearing out of the woods. As she saw him, she felt like she was dreaming. He was a tall, handsome stranger, and something about him made her want to go to him. As she approached him, she saw a startled look cross his face. Even as he appeared surprised, he looked handsome. When she was close enough, she smiled at him and said, What brings you here, stranger? She wasn't surprised when he said, I came to seek a young maiden. It is very important that I find her soon. She could tell he must be on an important quest. Maybe he was seeking a maiden for a neighboring prince. It was the very thing she dreamed of. She looked back down the lane to the fountain, but could not see it. She then turned to face the man and said, Could I be the young maiden you seek? When he nodded, she just said, I'll go with you. Just let me tell my family. She was stunned when he grabbed her arm and said, There is no time. This is very urgent. We must go now. As she looked in his eyes, she could tell he was serious about his request. She nodded again and followed him. As they entered the forest, she started to wonder if she was making the right choice. As they moved, she relaxed, because it didn't seem he meant her any harm. She even felt relaxed about it. It was as if some magical force was calming her. She continued to follow the man, and then told herself that when they got to where they were going, she would have to notify her family. She didn't want them to panic for long.